Hello everyone, welcome to this joint webinar from the ICB Advanced Productivity, ICB Business Excellence, Galway Taste for Success and Aviation SkillNet Learning Networks. Today's webinar, Global Voice on Micro-Credentials, What's Next for Industry in Ireland, follows last month's webinar and the first National Micro-Credential Survey, which was undertaken in Ireland by the National Institute of Digital Learning at Dublin City University. Today, our panel of four experts will present and discuss the results of this survey and help contextualize them with global trends in this space. The ground rules for today: the presentation of the survey results will be broken into three distinct sections, with each panel member sharing their insights following each section. When the last presentation/insights are complete, we will finish up by opening the floor for comments, questions, and observations from the virtual audience themselves. Everyone is muted, but we really do encourage you to use your webcam and to submit questions or comments via the chat function, which will be moderated during the presentations. If you wish to ask a question during the Q&A, please unmute yourself, call out Mairéad's name, followed by your own and your comment or question. This will stop us talking over each other. If we encounter problems with broadband, please bear with us just in case we need to pause any of the cameras. This session is being recorded. Now I will pass you over to Associate Professor Mhichíl from the National Institute of Digital Learning at Dublin City University to introduce the panelists. Mairéad.
So, thanks very much, Owen, for that. And I'm delighted to introduce the panelists today. It's been a pleasure to work with all three in the past, and I hope we'll continue to work in the future. But we're here today to talk about micro-credentials, and we're dealing with we have a panel which are very much representative and very much leading out in the different aspects of micro-credentials. So, as you know, and thank you, Owen, for introducing me, I'm an Associate Professor and Senior Research Fellow with the National Institute of Digital Learning, and I'm DCU's lead person on the initiative of getting micro-credentials and MOOCs in place. I'd like to welcome also the Director of the National Institute of Digital Learning, and that's Professor Mark Brown. You may have heard him on our last webinar that we had. Mark has taken a keen role in micro-credentials, and I think one of the standout areas for Mark at the minute is that he is a member of the European Commission Expert Group on Micro-Credentials, which is coming up with a framework for micro-credentials in Europe. So we're going to get some value insights from the European perspective from Mark. It's a great pleasure I introduce Professor Beverley Oliver. Indeed, she has been a national and international change leader, and she has many accolades to her name, including that of being Deputy Vice Chancellor of Education at Deakin for a number of years and implementing huge changes in Deakin University in Australia. Beverley has written extensively on micro-credentials and perhaps is, I think, the key author in this micro-credentials, and has produced one of the main publications that has dealt with micro-credentials and their development. Also, I'm delighted to introduce a lovely lady, a fellow Irish woman, Tara Rodoni. Tara is the founder of Qualibrates and Sage Education Management and Sage Education Marketing. And I think of Tara as really as one of those. She is exactly that. She is a sage. She is a link between industry and higher education, and she's provided really useful and insightful thoughts on expansion strategies for digital education, because she brings a huge amount of insight into what industry wants and tries to marry that with what universities are trying to do. She's worked with a huge number of industry and also a huge number of academic partners all across the world. So I'm delighted that we have this panel with us today, who are going to go through some of the results that we have been working on with the 5 SkillNet partners. And really what we wanted to do today was just to show some of the results of the survey that we have been doing, and to get their thoughts, our panelists' thoughts on that, from their perspectives, from their research, from their work on the ground, and also from their policy work in different areas. And as Owen had said, please do feel free to use the chat, and we can build upon the interaction then at the end. But I'm going to keep moving us on and talk a little bit about that. We will at the end disseminate our insights paper, so you will be able to read through some of the work that we're doing. And we're calling this a snapshot because this area is moving so quickly. So really, as part of the research, as we have said, we issued a national employer and employee survey. So we're going to take a look at some of the results from this. And the first one is that, and I'm going to say roll it there, Elaine, because Elaine, our research assistant, has been working really hard on this. And this is the employees. And the interesting the employer's results. The interesting part of this is that, you know, what do employers know about micro-credentials in Ireland? And it seems to be a very even split, is that some of them have heard it and some of them have not. So that's just a quick overview of that one. If we move on the lane, am I knowledgeable about micro-credentials? So from a personal perspective, we can see that there is a very indicative that they don't really know. So again, it's just corresponding to this notion of it's a term, it's something that's not widely known about. So I think just to cast it over to our panel for a minute, I really want you to think about and just provide your insight. I might ask Tara to start off. You know, there's obviously a varying level of knowledge from employers about what micro-credential are. What do you think is the next steps to sort of decrease this discrepancy in what they think they want, what we think that they need to know, and what they obviously need to get to with regards to micro-credentials in their knowledge base?
Thank you, Mairéad. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things when I see these type of surveys is, you know, when you talk to industry or enterprise and they say that they have or have not heard of a micro-credential, is really digging into, you know, what type of micro-credential have they heard about, because it's such a broad spectrum. Micro-credentials is a term that's becoming very generalized, you know, something that's a 2-hour video versus 16 weeks with true credentials under academic rigor. And when I'm talking to, you know, learning and development people or CEOs of companies, and we discuss micro-credentials, when you hear, yes, we know about micro-credentials, and then when you dig into it and you find out that they really don't understand the difference of a micro-credential versus a digital badge that you could just, you know, go on LinkedIn, for example, right now, is you can do a little test. It takes you 5 minutes. And if you pass it, you can put on your LinkedIn profile that you have a badge. And some people consider that a micro-credential. So I think what the biggest point is to make sure that there's a real understanding of what they're looking for to achieve in the upskilling or the education of their employees, and with the results that they're looking for, so that they can then measure what type of a micro-credential they're actually seeking or looking to incorporate into their training program.
Okay. Beverley, you've done a little bit of categorization of different types of micro-credentials. What would be your follow-on from that based on your work?
Well, I agree with Tara, which is always a good thing to do, but I absolutely do. I think it's a matter of language, and it's a new word, Mairéad. When I first thought about this, I thought, well, you know, if you'd asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I wouldn't have known what it was either. I don't think we collectively have agreed and know. So I might start at a slightly different place and say, well, I might talk to employers about macro credentials, because I think most people understand what that is when you explain it, as in formal qualifications, post-school, bachelor, master, doctorate, whatever. Most people understand that currency, and it is about trying to understand the currency. And then I think, building on what Tara said, I think micro-credentials for me are anything that's an assessed learning experience which is less than a formal qualification. So it could be something, as Tara said, something very brief, could be an hour, could be 100 hours, it could be, you know, 10 weeks. The difference is that we need to be able to sort them out and give employers the cues that they're used to make sense of them. So when people talk about a bachelor degree, for example, most people have a bit of a frame in their head about what that means, probably 3 or 4 years of full-time study, et cetera, you know, assessments, exams, all sorts of things. And as this micro-credential thing matures, I guess we will come up with some key signals and markers that help employers make meaning out of them, and also sort the wheat from the chaff in some ways, you know, because, you know, Tara's example of someone getting a badge and sticking it on LinkedIn, an employer needs to be able to read this signal to say, well, what is this telling me that you can do? And so what did you need to do it? So I might say a bit more about that later, but that'd be my first response, that it's a matter of language. And if we talk to employers about short courses, certifications, these are all in that grey zone that we call micro-credentials.
Okay, thanks very much, Beverley. Mark, I know that you've been doing a lot of work to try and come up with a European definition, and language has been really, really important. So what are the sort of the key elements of the language that Europe are looking at? And can you give us any insights into the way that Europe is thinking about the treatment of micro-credentials?
Well, thanks, Mairéad, and interesting hearing the comments already. I think in many respects that quick snapshot confirmed in many respects what we already had a hunch, that people didn't really understand what we're asking them, if you like, in the first place. And it's also probably worth noting that it's likely that you have a purposive sample here. So you've more likely got people who are, shall we say, predisposed to an interest, who have completed the survey. So if less than 50% or around 50% don't really have a clear understanding or much experience, I think that's pretty much what has been already established. And in the first webinar in this series, we shared some results that were from a QQI survey last year, where it was around about the same amount, and those were HR managers. More immediately around the European level, actually we did a survey was circulated amongst the expert group with a number of definitions taken out of some of the leading scholars, including your own work, Beverley. And, you know, even amongst that group, there wasn't a consistent, coherent definition that emerged. So it just underscores for me that there are two elements here. One, it requires an educative dimension. We do need to work with people here and help them come to some kind of understanding. And secondly, there needs to be a framework that this fits within that supports that educative dimension. So that's really what the Commission's trying to do. Time will tell whether that's successful.
And, you know, you're working for a commission that is working for many languages and in many different guises. Can you come up with some of the key words that are coming through that definition, Mark? Like, what are the key concerns that are coming through the language that's been spouted by the Commission? Where are the sort of the points that the Commission are getting a little bit hot over, or are you all in agreement?
I think keywords that spring to mind are currency, coherence, consistency. I use those 3 C's. And probably just be a little unique, add an A in there to talk about the importance of assessment. And that example that was cited around LinkedIn, you know, if there isn't some kind of credible assessment, formal assessment, it's very hard to call this a credential that's gone through a verified process. So I think it's fair to say at this point, there is a strong leaning towards needing to have something that follows very rigorous and robust and accepted quality assurance processes, and processes that go beyond just quality assurance.
Okay, so assessment is key, currency is key, coherence is key, and consistency, and obviously all of those being assessed. And I suppose the reason for assessment more than anything else is to support all of the 3 C's that come underneath it. I think we'll move on, Elaine, and we look at some of the interests and drivers that we were trying to really find out. So to what extent is your company or organisation interested in integrating micro-credentials into training and CPD programs? So if half of the employers are saying, yes, we know about them, let's see what they were actually going to do in regards to application. So as you can see, the 2 top answers there was this company is likely to consider integrating. So therefore the intention is there that they may consider it. So again, potentially this has to do with knowing a little bit more about what the term actually means and what's going to happen out of them. And also the company is currently exploring and considering integrating micro-credentials into our training and CPD programs. So I think that this is so this is currently exploring. So this is active engagement in this. I think one of the key markers for us, it was always really easy to do this beforehand, before we all moved to digital, and you could look at the newspapers. Do you remember, you know, the job sections in newspapers? You could really see there what were the key skills and requirements. But now you have to go onto some of the job websites. So I would love to hear from, I'm going to just cut in at this stage and just ask like the panelists, you know, from your experience with employers, are you hearing that they are seeing that micro-credentials are potentially part of their recruitment process? Are they accepting that in lieu of other forms of certification and of certificated learning? I'll throw that at Tara because you look like you're ready to go, Tara.
Well, I just interesting. I had a very long conversation yesterday with a panel of employees, and so the fourth revolution skills gap is really causing turmoil on top of this pandemic within organizations, and implementing the ability to upskill, not necessarily just as a retention or as a recruitment tool, but as a retention tool. Because as you've got people that are skilled into these roles, and when you look at some of the skills gap, they're so massive that if every university in the world were to be training people in certain, AI or some of these other high demand roles, they still couldn't produce enough people. So, this is very similar to what we went through when the dot-coms were at the height in the 90s, which was, we would train people or we'd hire people and we were giving them at that time $10,000, $20,000 sign-on bonuses, and they'd come to you 6-8 weeks later and say that they were resigning. And you'd be like, but you have to pay back the sign. Oh, don't worry about it. Yahoo's paying for it. And they gave me a Porsche. And so, the ability to retain people and keep your institutional knowledge is such a critical component. And being able to offer, skill-based training for the new technologies and the new information that they need to stay relevant and what's happening with the transformation in the industry right now is such a critical component. But it's also, recruitment is part of it, and being able to make that integrated into what they're offering is clear, but it's also progressive. So if you start looking at the management track, in the old days, you would, identify people that were, your bachelor degree people, and then you'd put them, they were in a management track, and you'd send them off to do an MBA, and they'd be gone for a couple of years and come back. And that's just not part of the model anymore. They've got to keep people working. They want to keep them on campus, still doing what they're doing, but they want them to continue to be educated. So I haven't spoken to any company in the last 6 months that isn't integrating short courses and micro-credentials. And they're doing it by using third parties and partnering with universities because they can't stay relevant. In the old days, I'm old, so my perspective is, we got sent off to 3 days training someplace, and we all sat in a room, and they, droned on with, PowerPoints or whatever, and half the time you were on your phone or you were excusing yourself to go make phone calls back in the days when we had pagers and things like that. And you really, it's a checkbox. You sat through your corporate training and then you moved on to do something else. And, they can't do that. They can't stay relevant enough to be able to keep abreast of everything that's happening. So they're really dependent on working with professionals and keeping that rigor and those standards for the universities and other higher education providers. And as well as doing that goes back to the original conversation is, how do I know as the HR team or whatever, when you walk in and say you've got a certificate of cybersecurity, of introduction to cybersecurity or AI developer or whatever, what does that mean? Did you do a full on, 6-month course through a coding boot camp? Or did you, go online and do something through, one of the MOOC providers? And, so how do I measure that? And how do I look at that when I'm, looking at your compensation? And how do I look at that as looking at your career progression or your annual reviews and stuff? So that goes back to Beverley's point, which is there really needs to be standardization, and to Mark's point about a framework. And that's something that's really frustrating to almost everyone I've spoken to in enterprises. They're at a loss to understand which of the thousands of programs that are out there do they direct their people to, because they don't feel like they have any control over understanding what's being taught or what the assessment really means within that system.
Okay, thanks, Tara. Just picking up on that point, and I suppose, Beverley, this is really for you, the elephant or the virus in the room, COVID-19, please God, it's not in anybody's room, but you know, we've seen where a lot of the major sort of MOOC, the massive open online course platforms, you know, Coursera, Futurelearn, edX, all of those, they've had massive increases in the numbers of people engaged with them. How do you think that, because that's going to obviously have a knock-on effect, you know, because a lot of those people are engaging now. So it's not just the people who are, you know, trying to get somewhere. It's not just the leisure, you know, people who are doing some of these courses for hobbyists, etc. These are people now who are looking for different jobs and different roles because of the change COVID has brought, the disruption it's brought. So what's your, yeah, sorry. Everyone.
Well, I was going to say, I think when we feel under threat and there is massive change coming, particularly to the job market, then we fall back on a credential, micro or macro, to use the terms, as evidence that we have skills and capabilities. So we go back to the point of looking at assessment, as Mark said, and I think that's the essential ingredient in a micro-credential and a macro-credential. If someone assesses you, someone is attesting that you have demonstrated that capability. And I think one of the great advantages of this is, yes, people will go on open platforms, Futurelearn, Coursera, etc., and they will learn new skills and they will get new certifications. That's good. But the other way of doing it too is people who have a job want to make sure they keep a job as well. So even those who may be quite secure want to be sure. So one of the things you can do with micro-credentials as an employer is actually certify your own workforce. You can measure and ask them to evidence their own capabilities, hard skills and soft skills, so that you can actually get a capability map of your company. And that could be quite good if you have a strategy and you know you want to go somewhere and this is your current workforce and you actually quantify their skills through some micro-credentialing or certifying program, then you can map out where you need to add and enhance those skills. And also, in my experience working with a university who was involved in this, that often is a wonderful boost for current employees. You know, all of a sudden they find their confidence because they thought they were good at something, but now someone else has actually verified that they're good at some particular hard or soft skill. So this can be an excellent human resources development project, I think, to actually help people quantify and certify all the skills they have, which are often considerable.
Thanks, Beverley. I think one of the key words when you said it, when you were speaking there, that sort of stuck out in my mind was, you know, that somebody else has attested your learning. Somebody else has said that you've got that. And we all, you know, that external validation is really, really important. Mark, I think from your perspective, you were saying something earlier about, you know, the notion of the trusted provider, the trusted. And we know with micro-credentials that some of the trends is that the co-construction with industry and the development of curricula to ensure that this trusted provider is also an informed provider. So not just, you know, a HE saying these are the skills that are needed, but that actually it's a work in tandem with industry. Can you say a little bit more about that and how that's working out?
Yes, it's certainly something that's on the table of discussion at the European Commission level. And it really picks up on the point that's made that existing credentials have that currency and credibility, and if you want to add even the coherence, because they come from institutions that have to meet certain requirements, and generally speaking, they're trusted. And when they're not trusted, and more often that's the case of a private provider, we've had the example in the language, second alternative language area here in Ireland, then usually there's a heavy price to pay. But at the same time, I think what I'm reading, and I've posted just a quick response, mindful of the time, to the current slide, is that the employers are up for a much more open ecology, or should we say a less restrictive ecology, where traditional qualifications on their own out of trusted providers are not enough. And it builds on the kind of ethos that we've already heard, that, you know, lifelong learning, skill development does not end when you finish college or university. And I think our system is still somewhat restrictive. You know, it's a bit of a cliche to say we're still stuck in the 19th century, but the truth is the credential, the macro credentials, to use Beverley's terms, actually arise out of the 19th century. And I think what employers are saying in this survey, albeit they're likely to be more receptive to some change, is they're actually looking for more creative and innovative ways to recognize and nurture and harness talent.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. Elaine, do you mind just moving it on to the next slide for me, please? So we actually said that, so what our next thing was, what were the potential benefits that they see of integrating micro-credentials into training and CPD programs? And I think, again, if we move that forward, it just says here, you know, to recognize and record hard and soft skills. So I think that feeds right into Beverley's point there about, you know, that capability mapping and that potential that would hold for a business, for an industry that would want to go into a particular direction. You know, one of the pieces of work that I think Tara has done and has done really, and has opened our eyes and my eyes to particularly, is the change in the workforce and what roles are going to develop and evolve, etc. So I think that's really, really important. And maybe Tara will speak a little bit more to that in a second. But one of the points that I wanted to bring up is this notion of soft skills. We know very much the hard skills that may be needed that are linked to do with technological advancements and other specific key areas where technology has made particular inroads into. But it also seems in the analysis that has been done is that the soft skills still remain a huge part. So the things that you expect people to know, whether it's team building, communication, etc., they seem to be a key area. Tara, what are your thoughts on this? Because I know you've done quite a bit of research into this part, into these things.
Yeah, your point's well taken, and I think this pandemic has made it even more so, because with people working remotely, you lose a lot of the natural assimilation with soft skills. You know, that your ability to communicate and your ability to interact with a team and be able to prioritize cross-functionally and things like that. When you're now living in basically isolation and working on Zoom calls, we spoke about this yesterday in the conference we were talking about, which is it's worked well in the US for people to work remotely. However, a lot of the executive level feel like they're missing the ability to have innovation happening on the spur, because everything's scheduled, everything's regimented. So if you are thinking of an idea that you might normally stop by somebody's desk or workstation or run into them in a room someplace and say, hey, wait a minute, what about this idea? That has been lost, because now it's, oh, well, we're speaking at 3 o'clock. And by 3 o'clock, you've got 100 new emails, and that thought that was in your head is now, who knows where it is. And the other thing is, I think when we start focusing on really building the technology skills through, I look at like coding boot camps and things like that, we are missing that soft skill piece of it. We focus very heavily on making sure that they understand the technology. But just when I look at, I was just looking up the definition of soft skills, and it's the personal attributes, but it's even being able to take criticism. When everything is over email or everything is done very regimented, it's difficult to say, well, maybe we could have done it better this way or that. And it's a skill that we aren't necessarily teaching young people coming in. At least, I currently have, some 26-year-olds that I'm very, in contact with. And those are areas they haven't been taught how to take constructive criticism. Everything's personal, everything's an affront. They don't know how to be able to implement ideas that someone's given them that's outside of their frame of reference. And the soft skill piece of that is so critical. Again, I think it's a struggle to be able to do that remotely, to teach those soft skills, because so much of it has to do with being able to read, personal inflection and to be able to watch body language and those type of things when it comes into it. but it's a key component that most employers are concerned about, having lost now because of this pandemic. And, you know, I think the other side that we're looking at is when we started, you know, 2020, everyone, or, you know, at the end of the year before we went into this, everyone was really focused on how do we bridge the skills gap based on what we anticipated was going to be the need for the next 10 years. Now, all of a sudden, we have this, you know, what do we do with supply chain? What do we do with manufacturing? What do we do with, you know, remote workers all over the place? And how do we restructure offices when they do come back in so that we have the social distancing and yet can still build teams and cross-functional teams? And everything that we've learned over the last, you know, 20 years about open workplaces and things like that, we're going to end up going back to cubicles and to try and give space. And you know, those are things that when I talk to management teams, you know, they're so removed from having to do that, and now they have to implement it. So there are additional skills that are being needed that weren't originally in the corporate planning, for lack of a better word, right?
Okay. I think, Elaine, will you just go on, because I'm just conscious of the time. Do you mind just going on to the next slide there? And I'll just want to pick up on a point that Tara says. So what factors would influence your company or organization to integrate micro-credentials? And this builds on what Tara's just said. You know, I think, look at that one right at the end, flexibility, you know. Beverley, you know, you've done a massive amount of research on this. Are these all the ones that you would have thought to come up? Are there any others that are missing from your knowledge of the space?
Assessment, accreditation, validation, yes. Cost and stackability. I'm going to kind of, in my mind, go back a couple of slides when you talked about whether employers would think about integrating their courses, their CPD, into micro-credentials. And I was thinking at the time, I might put it round the other way. Would you take your existing CPD, whatever that is, because I'm sure everyone who's joined us has a program already of staff development, human resources, and so on, and training, and it's probably systematized in some way. And it's about whether you can meld that into a stackable, and I'll come back to this in a minute, a stackable set of experiences that add up to something else. And that's what we mean by the stackability there. So to go back to Mark's point about consistency and coherence, you may have an array of things that may or may not actually integrate and work together at this point. But if you start with that idea of a capability map and you align all your current offerings across that map, you could actually recreate what you already have and make it into something that's in stackable blocks. And even more to the point, and going on one of the comments that was just made in the chat, you could make that like the lifelong learning journey, because not everyone needs everything at the same time. So it's a career map for people so they can see where they're going to be in the future in your company. And I think that's important. And if it can indeed stack up in any way towards a formal qualification that is of interest to the person, be that undergraduate or postgraduate, I don't see there's any harm in that. I see that as all incentive, because what I would love to see is people keep learning. And I think the pandemic has been an enormous lesson for us. We have all learnt. I feel like we've all been sent to our rooms to think about our lives for 6 months, and we're not allowed out until we actually think harder about the way we live. My greatest fear is that within, you know, weeks of coming out of this, we'll be zooming around the world in planes again and just like living a frenetic life.
We will.
Bernadine
agrees.
We will. However, you know, on that very point about hard and soft skills, it's the human side of us that we're suffering from most in this pandemic. We miss being able to meet people. We miss shaking hands and giving people a hug and interacting. I think it's shown us that it might have reminded us that the technical skills come and go. You can learn to code today and that can be out of date in a couple of years and you have to learn some more, and that's fine. But over your lifespan and your capability map, you accrue wisdom and humanity and experience and leadership and maturity, and they're all the soft things that we can evidence as well. And I think, you know, this is a wonderful opportunity for us, and this pandemic in many ways is a gift for an educated, engaged workforce across the lifespan.
Yeah, and I think, Beverley, you put it very nicely there and succinctly. And when I think of lifelong, I always think of life-wide as well. You know, it's life-wide learning, never mind the length of it's the breadth of what you learn is really, really important. Mark, to bring you in, do you have any, I'm going to wrap up in the next few minutes. I'm going to let Mark start up with a little wrap up because I have some chat questions for you. But Mark, do you have any things or insights you'd like to add at this stage?
I've just posted a few things in the chat box. So I think in light of time and to give our other panelists as much time in the remaining time we have, I don't think there's anything of substantive nature that I could add at this point. That was a long-winded way to say that, I have to say.
But why say it in two when you can write a long letter? I know it's the other way around because I didn't have the time to write a short one. Tara, from the States, what do you think we have to learn from the States?
I think what the biggest lesson here has been, to follow up on what Beverley is saying, is that we've forgotten the importance of the human interaction, the human touch with each other. You know, we're, especially in the States, you know, we are so driven here for bottom line, and, you know, people are, you know, trying to force people to go back to work in environments that still aren't safe because, you know, it's all about how much profit we're going to be able to make and what we're going to be able to do. And what this pandemic has taught is that, you know, you don't need to micromanage people. If you've hired the right people, they can work remotely and they can still be very productive and do what they need to do. But there has to be a way to provide that integration, to continue that human interaction, that human connection. You know, if your teams aren't feeling connected, and one of the things that's really been brought to point for me is new teams being hired, because obviously Calibrate's a new company and we're hiring people remotely that some of us have never met and may not meet for long periods of time because they're global. And obviously my American passport isn't worth a lot at the moment. So, you know, I'm not going to be flying around to meet these people. And so building a relationship and building trust and building confidence is really stretching somebody like me, who tends to like to be a little bit of a control person, you know, having to really have confidence in my hiring teams and my managers that they're bringing the people on to do the work and trusting them to be able to do it.
Thank you very much, Tara. Beverley, I'm going to leave the final word with your good self. You said you wanted to come back to something, and I don't know if you did manage to come back to it in your last remarks, but is there anything else that you think, you know, looking at our participants today who are coming from industry, some of them are coming from higher education, who are also maybe interested in getting into this space, what would be your words of wisdom? Because, you know, you've had a lot of experience with this in the Australian and internationally, so it'd be great to hear from yourself about how you would guide us.
Oh, gee. Well, I'll start by going back to the pandemic and what we've learned, because I think it really is pertinent to this. And I like to think about the opportunities, the things that we're doing now that we weren't considering doing before. A few months ago, I attended a conference that came out of London, but it was all virtual and it ran for a couple of days and it was on demand and it was a different kind of experience. But it was a lot more accessible for me, where I live in the world, to be able to actually attend and engage with people from around the world in my time zone. And I think this kind of new digital frontier, what Tara talked about, you know, hiring global teams, I'd like to think that we can all be more connected because we can actually work within a time zone, but digitally, and work with colleagues who maybe live in a different country, which we wouldn't have really considered doing before. So I hope it makes us more open, and therefore more open to sharing our experiences in this micro-credential space as well. I think also that I'd go back to a point that Mark made earlier, and I think, and maybe this is a good one to finish on if that's where we're going, and that is that we need an educative process, and we need to bring people along with us on this journey. So the word micro-credential can be a bit off-putting and a bit confusing, but if we break it down and talk to people in language they understand, and we explain, if we go from the known to the unknown, and we start with people understand formal qualifications, well, let's talk about those, and then there's this other thing, and it could take this form and that form, but these are the key elements of a good learning experience: assessment, evidence, engagement, and I think employability is going to be a huge one. So I think this idea of micro-credentials will live or die based on whether we deliver value to learners. And we already know that sometimes in formal qualifications, higher education providers and others get criticised because we're not actually delivering. The value is not there. Whatever the value is that the learner's after, it's not always there, and we need to do better. But we have a chance with micro-credentials to actually devise things that are cost-effective and valuable, and bring the learner to become an engaged, lifelong learner, so that they feel they're getting value out of this, not just value for money, value for time invested, but also they learned something valuable about themselves and about the world that they can actually bring to the community, either for personal interest or employment, whatever it is. So I think we are at a wonderful opportunity, even though some days it doesn't feel like we're in a great place. I see this as a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you very much, Beverley. I think Bridie has put something in the chat there, which is really, it really says it all: recognition, reward, respect. And I think that is a lovely way to wrap it up. Thanks very much, Bridie. I'm going to say, on a personal note, a huge thank you to Professor Beverley Oliver for joining us very late over in Melbourne, even though she's locked up. Hopefully she won't be locked up for very long, but through this, I suppose, new digital frontier, we can stay in touch. To Rodoni, who's in Louisiana, doing her best in a very warm state, I would presume at the minute, both politically and from a temperature wise as well. I'd also like to thank Professor Mark Brown, who is located now in Dublin, but as you can hear, he is not from these parts. He's a New Zealand native and is leading out in the National Institute for Digital Learning. And thank you from myself. And I'll just hand back to Owen Kennedy, who's going to wrap up on our behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mairéad. Just if there's any last minute questions that people wanted to use the chat, I think we have time for perhaps one more before we wrap up. I'm conscious that we're smack bang in the middle of everyone's lunch.
Dinner and breakfast, I'd say.
Well, exactly. Yeah, we're starting between all the time zones. Okay, Mairéad has done a lot of the thank yous. I'd just like to say that this research was jointly sponsored by the Aviation, ICB Advanced Productivity, ICB Business Excellence, GOE Executive, and Taste for Success SkillNets. And on behalf of Networks, I'd like to thank all the panelists for the insights and also everyone who contributed to the survey. The video and slides from today, along with an insights paper, will be made available to you following today's session. And to all of you who attended today, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.